So when I think about our communities, I think that, many of us haven't seen the roles that a real estate agent can play, right? So I am excited when I think about what the opportunities are for both educating our communities around various movements like the land back movement, like what a land bank is. These are some of the work I've had a chance to start doing right now. I have just met a part of my own family legacy. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, in which a part of that land was given to an ancestor of mine prior to slavery. One of my family members was able, in the role of a real estate agent, to help reclaim a part of that land that had been taken, you know, because of, all the other things that happened.
Let's pause for a moment and review just briefly how did we get here? And we'll use my favorite game that I share when I'm teaching this class, Jeopardy. More specifically, when fair housing has been in jeopardy. Now, if you're like me and you're an older millennial or a Gen Xer, you may remember the game that I have pictured on the screen. I know some of you, like me, may have wondered, why do we have to go on this Oregon Trail if we're gonna die? But it was fun. It was a great game in the 80s to play. It seemed very high tech. I didn't get it though as a kid. I did not understand the point of going somewhere where you had to die. But when we look into the history, it all makes sense. So using the game of Jeopardy, I'm going to give you the answer and you think about what is the corresponding question. Here we go. When Oregon's Constitution was adopted in 1857, affirmative action was offered so any married white male could receive up to this amount of acres of land free of charge if he chose to settle in Oregon. Now, when I teach this class live, I love the audience participation and people are guessing and they're saying things like 100 acres, 200 acres, which listen, that's a lot of acreage. But in reality, it was 1,300 acres. And for anyone that likes the show Yellowstone, I always say, move over, John Dutton. And although we're talking about Oregon and Yellowstone is not in Oregon, we know that this was something that was very popular as the quote, Old West was being settled. So the Homestead Act, which was formed in 1862, and eventually it expanded land ownership to everyone, including those who had been formerly enslaved, which resulted in an ownership surge of land. Hooray! Now, as Dr. Dietra is sharing her story about her family being a Black person or an African American, it is important to note that after this land rush, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, African American land ownership came to a peak in 1910, where African Americans owned about 14% of US land. That is very extraordinary. And a lot of families don't realize, like Dr. Dietra is sharing, that they have distant relatives who owned land after the Civil War, or maybe even before, and their family may still have a claim to some of that land. The interesting thing is that today, specifically, Black people own now less than 1% of US land. What happened? Well, I'm glad you asked. Unfortunately, although we as a country were moving in a wonderful direction where there was opportunity and access for land ownership, home ownership was the mantra of the day. Around 1910, all the way up until the civil rights movements, there was unfortunately active resistance to those, particularly those that were formerly enslaved, but it was not limited to them, where there was a taking of the land. We had theft through adverse possession. We had theft through eminent domain. Here in Georgia is the prime real estate property in Buckhead. This also was an area where eminent domain was used to remove Black residents from their homes, and this was in the 1940s. So again, between 1910 all the way up to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, we saw land that had been rightfully obtained, particularly by the formerly enslaved and passed on to the next generation, it was taken. Here's another example, but it's an example of how we, as real estate professionals, as well as community members, can do more to help these families that were denied fair housing reclaim their land, or at least their access to the income that's available. Out in California, you may have heard of Bruce's Beach. That was an idyllic oceanfront property that was seized from the Black community. It was returned to that family and they have decided to sell it. But the amazing thing about that legacy is that it has now spawned more land back movements. For example, here in Georgia, the University of Georgia was built on land that also had been stolen from the Black community through eminent domain. And now there is a push to get restitution for that land that was taken and not given fair market value. Beyond the land back movements, there is an opportunity to support preservation groups to help those that are in their homes stay in their homes. That is a part of fair housing. I have on the screen Miss Josephine Wright. And once I heard about this story, I reached out to the South Carolina realtors who are friends who have allowed me to do fair housing talks so that they could help her preserve this property that had been in her family since the Civil War, although recent developers were attempting to squeeze her out.
I was at a talk recently, and there's a movement in Georgia because, we moved all First Nation folks off of, out of Georgia. And a question from the audience to the representative was, what is the reparations that we should be working toward for for this community? And she's like, one of the things in our culture is not to need to reclaim everything, and that it is the acknowledgement and the releasing and being respectful. So she's like, we want, when you dig up a bone, that's not a bone, that is our family member. Put it back and bless the land and keep it sacred. And I was like, it's just learning how to, she's like, but we're not coming back because we already have family and that is not our culture. And I thought that is beautiful. And we need to have these conversations in our own communities about what does repair look like.